Welcome to Navigating the Customer Experience. Want to improve your organization's customer service? Looking for insider tips to knock your customer socks off? Then you're in the right place. Here's your host, Yannick Grant.
Welcome to Navigating the Customer Experience. On today's episode, our guest is Dr. Kaliym Islam. Dr. Islam is a former Wall Street executive where for over 20 years he led global learning businesses. New York Times best-selling author Kevin Kurse, the e-learning guru, describes him as a fresh voice among the usual author guru crowd, who brings the credibility of someone who makes a living doing rather than telling. Teams under his direction have been 1. Named Learning Elite Organizations by Chief Learning Officer magazine, 2. Won International Society for Technical Communication Awards for innovative learning content, and 3. Cited by HR Futurist Josh Bersin as best practice learning organizations. He's written thousands of industry and academic articles and a number of books that focus on leadership, strategy, organizational development, and training and development. His most recent book, The 12-Inch Rule of Leadership, highlights how leaders in industry, government, higher education, K-12, and entrepreneurship utilized a common framework, the 12-inch rule, to achieve career success. He's currently an assistant professor of practice at Southern Illinois University, where he helps develop tomorrow's educational leaders. So without further delays, plug your earphones in, sit back, relax, and let's jump right into this awesome conversation with Dr. Islam. Welcome, Dr. Islam.
Hey, Yannick, it's really good to meet you. I've been listening to your podcast, and I realized that, believe it or not, we may be related.
Really?
So my family left Jamaica, Westmoreland Parish, back in the late 40s, went to the Canal Zone to find work in the canal, where my grandmother married a Costa Rican and then relocated to Brooklyn. So I've got some Jamaican roots in my tree.
Nice, very nice. Have you ever been to Jamaica?
Several times. I love it.
Awesome.
One of my best countries to visit. Favorite countries to visit.
That is so good. And you've been back to Westmoreland to see if you have actual relatives there?
Absolutely. And there are a couple of there, but it's been a few years and they're up in age.
Yes, so, I can just imagine.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so Dr. Islam, I know I had read your bio, and that's a theory of, your journey. But I always like to give the guests an opportunity to just tell us in their own words how it is that you got to where you are today. Could you give us a little bit of insight on that?
Yeah, so when I look at my journey, I think I've got to go ahead and cite my inner Steve Jobs, right? You can't connect the dots forward. You can only connect them backwards. So if I had to look at my journey, I would sort of sum it up in 2 words, right, or 2 phrases: innovation and taking chances. So came out of the military, spent some time in the military after I screwed up in college for the first time, and wanted to change the world. So my plan was to change the world one child at a time. So I went into K through 12 education. And I started working in a very, very, at that time, poor community of Bushwick, Brooklyn. It's now a destination place, but at that time it wasn't. It was one of those neighborhoods where you see the car pan by, you see the burned out buildings and graffiti on the wall, and you hear the statistics about single mothers and drugs and AIDS and these types of things. And what I did is I started teaching school there, and I brought my military background, and I brought my my college fraternal background and my love for technology into the classroom. And at that time, my customers were essentially the students and the parents and the administration. So we put all those things together, being innovative and taking chances. And then students who really had not been successful in their academic careers suddenly started to achieve success. We had tremendous improvements. I leveraged that success and started writing curriculum, helping teachers use technology in the classroom. So I leveraged my technology background. I left the classroom because I realized that in the classroom, I could only help probably 30 students at a time. But if I was in more of an administrative position, I could impact policy, which could impact more students. So I took a job as an assistant principal at an alternative high school in Manhattan, overseeing their overseeing their technology and basically migrating them from, at that time was an Apple or Mac environment into a PC environment. So my interest started getting more and more toward technology and how technology can help people learn. Well, it was about at that time that my wife informed me that the salary of a school teacher did not afford her the life that she felt that she deserved.
I just love how you position that.
So I started looking at other opportunities, and I actually went to Wall Street initially to do some technology stuff. And we were actually deploying a new technology system. And I was in a meeting. The teacher and me never left. So I asked what was a dumb question back then. I said, well, what's going to happen on Monday morning when you deploy a brand new email system on Friday afternoon? And they said, well, we're going to get a lot of calls to the help desk, and there's going to be problems. And so are you positioned to support that? Well, they said, well, no, we're not. And they said, well, what should we do? I said, well, you should train people. You should give them an education program. What you should do is, rather than teach everyone at the same time, you rotate. You bring one department into the training. While they're in the training, you deploy the software to their desktop. So right after being trained on it, they can use it right away. Mm-hmm. The next question was, who can develop the training? I was a school teacher, had a degree in instructional design. So I went home that weekend, wrote the training program, and we deployed it, and it was very successful. Fast forward a few months later, we were deploying another software system. Same situation occurred. I was in a meeting. They said they're going to deploy it. I asked the dumb question, what's going to happen when you don't train people? Same scenario occurred. I went home, built the training program, and did the training. We had success. And then we had a third software system that they were deploying. Everyone looked at me and said, Kaliym, can you do the training? I said, absolutely not. No way, Jose. And they said, well, why not? You did it before. I said, yeah, but we're playing whack-a-mole here, guys. We're just reacting. We need a more strategic approach to go ahead to doing this training. Mm-hmm. Literally went home that weekend. I was a profuse writer. I wrote a strategic training plan for the company with, of course, me at the head of this technical training department. I walked in on Monday morning, gave the president of the company my proposal. He looked at me and said, well, start hiring your staff. So that was my full foray into sort of corporate supervision and corporate training. So we had a lot of success there. I had responsibility for employees. And then we realized that what we were doing for employees could be extended to clients. And so they said, okay, Kaliym, you now have responsibility for customer training. And when I looked at the landscape, I realized that it really didn't make a lot of sense to build up a staff of, 50, 60, hundreds of trainers to train customers, because when the need, and you got to look back, that was sort of late 90s where people were just learning how to use Microsoft Word, learning how to use Excel and all these other productivity programs. Mm-hmm. So we realized that, okay, once everyone is taught, we don't need all these trainers. So again, in the spirit of innovation and taking chances, we started working with what at that time was called CD-ROM training. So we'd actually program the training on a CD-ROM. You would send it out to the various locations, and that's how people would take their training. So left there after doing some good stuff there. Another company asked me to come in and oversee their or bring in technology. So that's what we did. We brought in technology for another firm, and I just basically kept sort of ascending up the ladder. And all these experiences, whether it was bringing in the new technology or whether different approaches or bringing in learning management systems, I always wanted to help people. So I would write about it in industry magazines, and then I started being asked to speak about it and things like that. And at some point after a bunch of years. And there's something that I neglected to say. After my wife let me know that a school teacher didn't make the money that afforded her the life that she thought she deserved, me leaving education, or K through 12 education, broke my mother's heart because she thought I had a gift. Mm-hmm. And I promised her, I said, Mom, I promise I'll go back at some point. So after 20 years of doing that and having a lot of success, I said it's time for me to fulfill my promise to my mother. And I left corporate America and started doing what my mother asked me to do, was going back into education. So I took on a job as a professor at Southern Illinois University and opened up a small boutique educational consulting firm. And now I'm sitting here having a great conversation with you.
All right. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Islam. Now, your book, The 12-Inch Rule of Leadership, could you share with our listeners what that whole framework is about? I'm aware of the fact that it consists of time value, best performance of duty, perseverance, the worth of example, the virtue of patience, talent expression, economic wisdom, the value of character, kindly attitudes, and pleasure in work, and the worth of the organization, and the dignity of simplicity. So it's a lot. But could you just summarize for us, in the best way possible, just for our listeners to get an idea of what this framework entails and who is it really targeted towards? Like, is it just for persons who are new and emerging leaders, or people who've been in leadership roles for years? Is this something they could take on to maybe sharpen their leadership skills?
Absolutely. Well, it's certainly something that anyone can take on to sharpen their leadership skills. So the background with the 12-inch rule. So, Yannick, I am a member of an historically Black fraternity or sorority, Phi Beta Sigma, and I'm sure that all fraternities and sororities have these types of things, where essentially there are things that you have to learn to become a member, things you have to memorize. And one of the things that I had to memorize when I was going through my process was the 12-inch rule. And that was, close to 40 years ago. And like you said, the 12-inch rule: time value, best performance of duty, perseverance, the worth of example, the virtue of patience, talent expression, economic wisdom, the value of character, kindly attitudes, pleasure in work, the worth of organization, the dignity of simplicity. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but after close to 40 years, I can rattle those things off like it's nothing. Mm-hmm. And what I started to observe over the years is that folks who joined this organization fell into two camps: those who, like me, could remember it and rattle it off, and those who would say, hey, that was a long time ago, I don't remember it. And what I observed was that the ones who remembered this rule and these principles, the 12 principles of the rule, their career trajectory seemed to be steep, whereas the ones that didn't remember it or said, hey, it was a long time ago, not that they all didn't have successful careers, but their trajectory wasn't as steep. So the academic in me tried to understand, why is this happening? So I actually set out to do an academic study. My plan was to do research and get this published in a peer-reviewed journal to solidify my academic chops. Mm-hmm. Now, after about the third interview, it blew my mind. I said, oh, my God. The stories that I'm hearing from these members in terms of what they did, how they applied each of the principles, and how it led to career success was mind-boggling. And I said, whoa, I can't leave this in an academic journal. There's got to be more of a wider distribution of this information, because it can help a lot of people. So we became agile, and we basically stopped on a dime and said, okay, listen, we're not going to write this in a language that's geared toward academics. We're going to write this in a language that's geared toward plain people who are trying to reach their full potential in terms of their leadership potential, who want to be able to communicate their value, who are tired of being looked over for promotion, and who are trying to become better as leaders. And that's what we did. And we interviewed 14 different members in a variety of industries, from K through 12 to higher education to entrepreneurs to people who are working in financial services, people who are working in government. And the tips and tricks and recommendations that they put out there was helpful to me. It reminded me of a lot. It taught me a lot. It helped me become a better leader. And, I know it's going to help other people. Just to tell one story, my son, I've got a 21-year-old who I could never get to read anything, ever. In fact, when he was a kid, I tried to pay him to read books. Wouldn't happen. Now, he picked this book up and said, Dad, wow, this is pretty good. This is going to be helpful for me. It's going to, some of the recommendations that they're talking about in the book, I can use on my job. He gave it to some of his college friends. Now, these are what is after millennials, Gen Z. Mm-hmm. They don't read anything, right, except Snapchat.
So true.
But my son started sending me pictures of his friends that they were, they were sending him pictures of them reading the book because they were so excited by it. So to your question, I think, no, it's not just the new and emerging leader. I think sort of old folks like me can learn from the book also. Younger folks who really haven't necessarily gotten to a position where they're supervising, I think they can get something out of it. I've seen it from my son's friends. And I've got a bunch of folks in the middle, in between, who have read the book and said, this has really been helpful to me.
Very good. So let's break it down. We went through, I listed the 12 steps in the 12 intro, right?
12 principles. Yep.
Pardon?
12, you can call them principles.
12 principles. So I just want you to maybe just give me a 1 to 2 cent summary of each one. So let's start with time value. What does that mean to a leader? Okay, so let's take, I'm going to do that, but I want to take a step back. So the beauty of this is there are no operational definitions. So time value, it's something you need to measure yourself by, but the fact that there's no operational definition really gives you the opportunity to apply it in a way that makes sense for you. So time value as an example, it's just that, valuing your time. So if you show up late, or my interpretation of it, if you show up late, okay, number one, you're not valuing the time of the person who you're supposed to have a meeting with. Okay, number one. If you're not spending your time on the right things, okay, you're not valuing time. So one of the contributors in the book, his name is Jean-Guy Latour, and he's the chief learning officer for the city of Bloomingdale, or township of Bloomingdale in New Jersey. So he tells a story about how when he showed up at the city hall one day, and he was working on one technology problem that was happening while he was visiting. Now, while he was there, he got wind they had been experienced some ransomware. So some bad actor threw some ransomware on the computers of the township that would put a lot of other things in jeopardy. Now, the issue that he was that he initially came there to deal with was important. And that was his initial, where he initially expected to spend his time. But as soon as the other issue came up, he realized my time is better served addressing the ransomware issue. And on a dime, he shifted his resources. And all the people who contributed to the book have different stories about how you can value your time. Okay.
Right. Number 2 is best performance of duty. It seems simple enough, but how do you do your best when you don't feel your best?
Very good point.
Okay. That therein is the challenge. And I tell a story in the book of one of my experiences was, suddenly someone in my organization quit relatively quickly. We lost 2 levels in an organization, and I had to step in and basically perform as a technician and a project manager, sort of well below, when I say below my depth, well, out of my depth. I'm more of a strategy guy, so that sort of level of detail really was what killed me. Mm-hmm. But if we didn't do a good job for the client, we were not going to take on, some additional business. So even though I hated the work, even though it was out of my depth, even though it was something I really, really, really did not like to do, I had to perform my depth. I had to perform my best at all times. So that's just one story. Perseverance. Like how do you keep fighting through when things get rough? And
I think that's applicable to anybody. I mean,
anybody. Exactly.
Not even leaders, just human beings, because things don't stay easy all the time.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the point. So, I tell the story in the book. There was a time where I think I shared how I initially came to Wall Street to do technology stuff, and I was overseeing a small, at that time they called it desktop support. So this is before all this remote stuff where you can just take over someone's computer. Back then, you literally had to go to the person's desk and install the software and plug everything in. Mm-hmm. So that was my job. I oversaw a team to do that, and we had a project to install it in a place within financial services called the cashiers. They call it the cage. That's the terminology that if you're on Wall Street, because the only people that go into that department are the people that work there. They really don't get visitors. So if a strange person comes in, all conversation stops. It gets real quiet, and they watch as you walk across the floor. So my job was to deploy some PCs to that organization, and to do what I had to get the blessing of the guy we called the king of the cage. His name was Fred Quinones. He was a VP there, executive VP there. Worked his way up from the mailroom and let everybody know that he enjoyed his position. He was the kingmaker. So I sent an email to Fred trying to set up a meeting so we could schedule the deployment of the PCs. It went unanswered. Left a voicemail, went unanswered. So I did what I used to do back then. I would do what I would call a drive-by. I figured I would just stop by his office and start a conversation. I walk into the cashiers, and there's silence. Everyone watches as I walk across the floor. And I get to the corner office, and in front of Fred, he's got a glass office, so you can see he's in there reading his newspaper. And in front of his office is his assistant, his gatekeeper, Ann Galante. And I introduced myself, said I'd like to speak to Fred. She says, well, he's busy. Now, mind you, I'm looking at the guy reading the newspaper. She says, well, he's busy, come back later. So I go back, another email, another phone call. I figured, let me show up at a different time of day. So I showed up at, maybe 12 in the afternoon, same scenario, get into the cashiers, noise stops. I walk across the hallway or across the room, look at Fred reading his newspaper. I ask Ann if I could speak with him. He's busy. So this happened 3 or 4 times. And now my boss is saying, hey, when are you going to get those PCs deployed? So I'm feeling some pressure. I said, okay, let me just try one more time. So I show up again, same scenario. I'm walking back dejected, and a gentleman pulls me aside. He says, listen, you're disrespecting Fred. He's an important man. He's a busy man. And you show up here in the middle of the day. He doesn't like it. Fred shows up in the morning at 7 o'clock. He likes jelly donuts, and he likes his coffee sweet and light.
Mm-hmm.
So the next morning I show up at 6:45 with jelly donuts and coffee. Fred walks in. I'm sitting outside of his office. Fred walks in, and I said, hey, Fred, I hear you like jelly donuts and coffee. He said, come on, Kaliym. Come on in. I didn't even know he knew my name. Okay. Long story short, we did the project. Everything worked out. Everything worked out well. We were successful. And at one point during the middle of the day, I needed to meet with Fred. I couldn't wait till a 6 o'clock jelly donut meeting. So I go across the cashiers, and by this time, no noise stops. Everyone keeps working. They don't even notice me. I walk across the floor. Fred is in his office, obviously in a busy meeting. I'm looking at Ann and say, I really need to meet Fred. Fred looks up. He walks out of his office and says, what do you need, Kaliym? I let him know. He tells other people in the office, I got to meet with Kaliym, and he kicks him out.
Wow.
So the tide certainly changed.
You made a complete 180.
180. So I'm walking out of the cashier's area, and this guy, Ron Kowalski, certain names you remember in your career. He says, Kaliym, most people stop after the second effort. I'm glad you kept going.
Perseverance,
right? Perseverance. The worth of example. We have Joe West, and he's a Harvard-trained epidemiologist in the book. And he runs a small boutique consulting firm. He happens to be African-American. And he tells a story of how before, the advent of the internet, we can just go online and see anyone's name. He was working on a deal with a client, and things were working well. And he actually got the opportunity to go to their executive offices and meet with them.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes to the offices, and the secretary puts him in the room, and the executives come in. And as soon as they walk in, he could see from the look on their face that they didn't expect that Dr. Joseph West from Harvard was an African-American.
Wow.
So there's an awkward moment in the beginning, but then they start to make small talk, and then they realize that, wow, Joe West, he likes a lot of the same things we do. He likes to golf. He likes to play cigar. He likes to smoke cigars. And guess what? He loves Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. Long story short, Joe, gets the job. His team does a phenomenal job for the client. And then the client asks him, hey, do you have any of the firms that are just like you who can do some other work for us? So, of course, Joe goes and recommends another firm. They happen to be African-American also. So he tells a story of how how joyful he was when he came back to do a report for these executives, and he sees the firm that he recommended in the hallway or in the outside by the secretaries waiting to meet with the executives.
Right.
And he believes it's because of the example that he set as a business owner and how he presented himself.
Okay, the worth of example.
Yes, right. Next one is the virtue of patience. So we have a story in the book, Michael Dove. And Michael Dove is an executive at PCSU, which is a financial services firm. He's actually located in St. Petersburg, Florida. And he tells a story of how his team used to get frustrated because they would make recommendations to the executives and the executives wouldn't act on them. And what he had to instill in his team was, if you have a good idea, the idea is going to remain good. You've got to be patient. Don't discard everything that you've done, because they're going to come back around and they're going to use that idea. So what he did, he made sure that anytime one of his team members made a recommendation that was rejected, that they kept all the documentation. And what they started seeing was that a lot of times they would make these recommendations, and while they were initially rejected, sometime 4, 5, 6 months later, they would be accepted. Okay. And had they not learned to be patient, they might have gotten rid of all the documentation that was associated with some of those recommendations or those projects.
Right.
The next one is talent expression. And that's really about making sure folks understand what you can do, what you're capable of. And sometimes that's also tricky, right? Because sometimes when you let people know what you're capable of doing, they look at it as bragging.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't do it, it could cause some other issues. So in one of the organizations that I led, we had a woman who, she was a documentation specialist, but she loved doing voiceovers. And she did that, on the side to make money.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were having a lot of trouble finding affordable voiceover talent. We tried to outsource stuff to different countries, but the accents just didn't work out.
Mm.
And I remember, one day in a skip level, I think it was a 2-down meeting, we're having some conversations about, where she wants to go in her career and what she does when she's not at work. And she mentioned, I do voiceovers. Like, wow, we need voiceover talent here for some of the work that we're doing. So had she not spoken up and talked about what she's good at, she would never have had that opportunity. And she parlayed that into a bunch of other, great personal and business opportunities.
That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Economic wisdom. So we have a story in the book, Nigel Coelho, and he works for the folks that make the coffee for Starbucks and all these other sort of coffee houses. And he was talking, he speaks to, I always have to remember that this isn't my money, right? This is the company's money. So he has to look at it like that. He can't spend it in the wrong way. So they had to make a decision at one point about whether they invest in a $50 million project, which was in one area, versus a $30 million project, which was in another area. And the more expensive investment would have been great for his organization, but not for the company.
Mm-hmm.
So using his economic wisdom, he made the decision to do what was best for the company.
Makes sense.
Yep. Okay. The value of character. We have there's an individual, Reverend Dr. Tyree Anderson, and he tells the story of how he took over as the new pastor of a church in Alabama. And the old pastor would let anyone walk in at any time. He didn't want people walking in to cause a disturbance with the sermon. So he implemented a rule that only, if you weren't there when the sermon started, there were certain times during the service where people could come in. And so this was new to some of the older parishioners. So there was a woman who, when she was able to come in, I guess they were having a sort of meet and greet where they walk around and greet the new visitors. Mm-hmm. And she literally cursed him out.
Wow.
As he was walking on the floor in the church. And he talks about how it took everything in him to maintain control, right? And maintain good character even though his character was being assaulted in front of everyone. Kindly attitude. So we have Kobina Thomas, who was an executive for UPS, United Postal Services in New York. And he tells a story about how he had to let someone go, but he had to do it in a way that maintained respect for the person who he was letting go and maintain respect for him. Pleasure in work. We have a lawyer, Cedric Ashley, who is the editor of one of these legal associations' quarterly journal, and he speaks to the importance of finding something in work that gives you pleasure, or else it's all agony. He tells a story of helping a woman who was terminated unfairly. And the joy that he got from doing that, not because she compensated him, I mean, he did get compensated well, but just to see how relieved she was when the stress of everything that was happening in her life, how he was able to take that off of her shoulder, and the pleasure that he got in that. Mm-hmm. And he also speaks to, that what you consider pleasure in work changes over the course of your career. So an 18-year-old is going to look at it differently than a 15-year-old in the workforce. Then we have the worth of organization. We have Will Worley, who is a principal at a school in, I think, East Orange, New Jersey, and he just tells a story about just being organized and making sure everyone is on the same page, and how he was able to leverage that to provide educational services to his students and his community during COVID. And then lastly, the dignity of simplicity. So we have Jerome Evans, and Jerome is a former national championship for the University of Florida Gators football team, but he's also an executive at a company that sells industrial materials to big construction firms, and he just talks about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and speaking in a way not that shows how smart you are, but speaking in a way that people get it. And how he speaks the same way to his billionaire clients as he does to the people that clean his house, and how that's impacted his leadership. So we've got a lot of stories, but again, these principles are ones that individuals can interpret and use in a way that works for them.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Islam, for that in-depth summary. And I know it definitely has given our listeners a greater insight on the value that the book can bring to them and their teams in the organizations that they're leading. So we're definitely going to have the link to the book in the show notes of this episode. Now, Dr. Islam, could you share with us what's the one online resource, tool, website, or app that you absolutely can't live without in your business?
Oh, Basecamp. Basecamp. So Basecamp is essentially a communication tool. So I know a lot of companies are going to sort of agile project management tools, whether it's Monday.com or Plutio or Xera, those types of things. But Basecamp for me is a great tool for project communication. So it allows any documents, you can upload it. If there's a communication, whether it's through email or you type it directly into Basecamp, all the communication comes there. So for me, in terms of staying organized and knowing what's going on with projects that I'm working on or clients that I'm helping, Basecamp is required. Okay.
Could you also share with us maybe one or two books that have had the biggest impact on you? It could be a book that you read a very long time ago, but it still has, really resonated with you to this day. Or maybe even one that you've read recently that really, struck a chord and you would want to recommend it.
Sure. So let me give you a couple, right? So one is Our Iceberg is Melting. Phenomenal book. Most people are familiar with Who Moved My Cheese, or Someone's Moved Our Cheese. To get the exact title. And that book is about basically you show up and things have changed, right? So you have no choice but to react to it. Our Iceberg is Melting is a story of a colony of penguins, believe it or not. And this one penguin, Fred, he's friends with everybody else, but he likes to go off and learn things. Mm-hmm. So he likes to dive underneath the iceberg. And at some point, Fred sees a bubble in the bottom of the iceberg and it hits him, hey, I think our iceberg must be melting. Now, he doesn't have a lot of evidence, and from the story, Fred is really a junior person, but he's got to now convince the entire colony of penguins, that they've got to change their way of life, because if they don't, they're going to die because the iceberg is melting. And he has to do that with just a little bit of evidence that's below the iceberg that's really inconclusive. And to me, that's the job of a leader. That you can't just focus on the here and now. You have to be looking at what's going to happen. What are some things that may cause your business to demise, or what are some opportunities you need to take advantage of that's going to help your organization be successful? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you don't find those things at the surface. You got to dive underneath the surface to find those things. So that book is tremendously important to me. Has been helpful. The 1 Minute Manager, because that's all about supervision and communication, and doing it in a way that allows you to maintain first principle, 12-inch rule, time value.
Mm-hmm. So true.
Okay. Another one is strength-based leadership. So rather than forcing people to do things they don't do well, why not put them in the position where they can spend most of their time doing the things that they're naturally good at?
True.
Yeah. So those are the three that I would share.
Okay, awesome. So we'll have the links to those books in the show notes of this episode. Now, Dr. Islam, could you share with our listeners what's the one thing that's going on in your life right now that you are really excited about? Either something that you're working on to develop yourself or your people.
Okay. Well, what I'm really, really excited about now, I am actually doing have a presentation scheduled in South Carolina for a large international organization, and we're doing a session on how do you take your organization from good to great. So I'm really psyched up about that. We've sent out a bunch of surveys to get a sense of how the individuals who are going to be at this conference, how they feel about it. And after looking at these surveys, they're going to be really surprised that they're not as good as they think they are. So I'm really excited about helping them figure out, okay, how do we take ourselves from where we are and get to the next level? So I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, so our listeners would have tapped into this episode and they're quite intrigued with your book, with your journey, and they'd like to follow you online. Where can they find you online?
Absolutely. So they can go to my company's website, thetrainingproacademy.com. Mm-hmm. And then we have a bunch of resources. In fact, we're actually relaunching the website on Monday. So as of Monday, they'll be able to go there and do some assessments to take a look at what their current leadership skills are. And we have resources to help them improve. They can go to my personal website, drkaliymAislam.com. Mm-hmm. Or they can reach me on Twitter at the Training Pro, or on LinkedIn at thetrainingpro.com, or the Training Pro Academy.
Great. So we're going to have all of the different handles for those different social media platforms as well as the websites so that our listeners can tap into those. Now, Dr. Islam, before we wrap our episodes up, we always like to ask our guests, do you have a quote or a saying that during times of adversity or challenge, you'll tend to revert to this quote? It kind of helps to get you back on track or get you refocused if for any reason you get derailed. Do you have one of those?
Absolutely. That term, it comes from a poem that from Muhammad Ali. It's called "Impossible is Nothing."
Impossible
is nothing.
Nice. Very good. Okay, so we will definitely have that quote in our show notes for this episode. Well, Dr. Islam, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to hop on this interview today for our podcast, to share all of these great nuggets and insights that you've garnered over the years, to share about your book and the value that it could bring to individuals as well as collectively in an organization. I really think that you offered us great value today, and I think that the content that you shared with us can definitely help to enhance the quality of leadership that team members and leaders will demonstrate in their day-to-day activities. And even some of the different principles that you shared with us, as I had mentioned, are even applicable to just an average person who is not necessarily leading anybody, but we all lead ourselves. So I mean, to some extent, we're all leaders because we have to lead our own lives. So even if we may not be responsible to lead another individual, I think some of these principles can definitely be applicable to how we navigate our own lives. And so I just really wanted to say thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's been great. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Awesome. Well, just want to remind our listeners, please feel free to hop on Facebook and join our private Facebook group, Navigating the Customer Experience Community, and feel free to follow us on Twitter. Until next time, I'm your host, Yannick Grant. We also have a new book available on Amazon, The ABCs of a Fantastic Customer Experience. It's available in ebook and paperback. So if you want to increase revenue in your organization, build a stronger service culture, and create employees or develop employees who are really mastering service delivery in your business, you need to grab a copy of this book. Until next time, I'm your host, Yannick Grant.
Thanks for listening. For more awesome resources to take your customer service game to another level, head over to navigatingthecustomerexperience.com. See you next time.